Had a really big lecture today, and I wanted to share it with you guys because I felt that it was even more important for men and women to both understand how crucial and important it is to be able to accept your psychology as it is. And you are not your psychology. But if you don't accept that you are, you won't be able to see the dimensions that come under that. And I've noticed that one of the biggest issues nowadays has been really that more people cope than they actually feel anything. And here's what happens if you live in a world where people live in their head. That people who live in their head see people that live with their heart as a problem to solve. Now, I've noticed this in my life is that I've had trust issues, and it's like, well, maybe they're warranted. And this is not one of those pages to where you're going to be able to hear the things that you like that are going to comfort you. In fact, actually, I want to elicit the different thing here, which is perhaps maybe your fears are warranted. And there's something very important about accepting that they are, and it's about not neglecting the life that you have experienced. Now, there's not everything is true about the things that you think. That's, of course, not the case, but I've noticed that in romantic relationships, the people that are in their head the most tend to be the worst in them. And it's like, well, why? You're probably thinking, well, it's the emotional people that the ones that can't make the decisions. And it's actually that the people that have a healthy relationship with their emotions tend to have healthy relationships. And that tends to be reflective in their ability to listen. So what I often notice is that most people don't listen. They don't even know how to listen. What they have is their past baggage that they haven't resolved or haven't even addressed, because maybe their past baggage is something for them to accept. And then they interact with the relationship, but they're not really listening to the person, because what they're really hearing is how it's going to happen again. And so they have a fear response to every time you do open up. And you can kind of think about how messed up this is, because for me, we were laughing in the group about how many dimensions there are to it. And I recognize that the conversation about emotions is a little bit more about listening and being able to recognize that the person that can listen is the one that has exposed themselves to the most of what makes them uncomfortable about themselves. And so it's very hard to lend an ear to somebody when you have a superficial level of understanding of yourself. Also recognize there's one thing that you can do to really upset people. It's that when they express something that they do feel, that you try to solve it, and you haven't even listened to the problem. I've noticed that people that are really connected to their emotions, which is about like 4% of people if there were 100% of the population. And I'm only saying that because it really takes an individual who has the courage to live with their heart. And so I recognize, well, what does it mean to live with your heart? It means to accept everything about your life that has been up to this point, and then to incorporate another dimension that you have been living without for too long. So one of the most important things that you could do on a psychological level is to be able to accept the past story. And that's a difficult one, right? Well, you're looking for a new relationship. It's probably why you're watching this. And you're probably like, well, how do I get into one? I have all of these trust issues. I don't know how I have the ability to open up. And, there's a long conversation that can go into that, but I want to keep it simple. And I want to keep it simple for the sake that you're too busy coping with what you see that is you. So if you've come out of a relationship, and this is for you, which is what most people say, which is a lie. I went into a relationship and then realized how lost I was after. It's just confirming what you saw in the relationship was something that you didn't like because you were in the process of being found. And so really what most happens to most people is that they have a single presentation, and that's the marketing gimmick. And it works, but here's the problem with it, is that if you're unaware of your underlying shadow, then you'd be realizing that this is really a product of manipulation to get attention. So then there it goes. There's a narcissistic thing that people don't like accepting. And then you'll also use them as a way to validate everything about your poor relationship with yourself. And so think of it more like a collaboration, not a relationship. And so now that's the modern distortion. So if you came out of a relationship and you've had a series of failed relationships, and perhaps maybe you're trying to reflect on why that is the case, well then of course you can kind of just accept maybe a little bit about what's mirrored around you, because the probabilities of you being with a person that has hurt you 3 times in a row is way too likely that you are not addressing something about you. And so maybe there are certain characteristics that keep coming up and you keep rejecting, and because you keep rejecting, they keep coming up. It's kind of like insanity if you think about it. It's to where you don't even consider the probabilities of how all of the people you've been with have not had the availability or have met your needs in any of those ways. And let me guess, you're probably not the one creating it either. At least that's what you're telling yourself. So there is a psychological component that we have to accept here. And I notice that the psychological component that we have to accept is that story that it tells us about ourselves, that we actually subconsciously repeat in our relationships that allow us to further tell that story. So I've been struggling with this because I recognize that, the emotional aspect of things is so difficult to feel. And I realize that it's really difficult to feel anything, especially if you're not accepting the psychological story that you've told yourself up to this point, which is, it will never work. Someone will mess it up. They won't be able to meet my needs. And I recognize that in order to go into another dimension of yourself, you have to accept the first one. And sometimes that's your mind, it's your past, it's your story. And what I mean by acceptance is actually being able to see the deeper dimensions of yourself. And so there is a conclusive, I'd say a rational response to what most people have about love, which is ridiculous. Love is irrational in every sense of the word. And so, but it's not void of ration. It's not void of logic. It's not void of thought. And so you might have the people that say, well, you're probably getting in your head about this person cheating on you. But remember, your whole past has shown that to be true, that when this happens, they're doing that. And what do you tend to do? You tend to go, I shouldn't think about it. And no, look, here's the thing about your mind, is that it could fill itself off naivete because it's partially deceitful rationales. That's exactly what it is. So you're taking your mind and you're creating a rationale that self-deceits you and actually confirms a lie about what's really happening. And then you then tell yourself, well, I'm never going to let it go next time. I'm always going to be thinking with this because whatever this is completely right. And it's like, but yes, but no. No, because there's more dimensions to you. And if there's more dimensions to you, there's more dimensions to others, then not everything is a conclusive equation. So remember, your mind works that way. 2 + 2 = 4. You don't like the answer 4. You associate that to what? I'm not lovable if it's this thing. So you increase the equation. You throw more variables. And you're still getting the same answer. That's the danger of not accepting things. It's not the end of the story. It's the beginning of it. It's the transformation of what you believed once was. Our mind is a very powerful tool, but it easily fools one too. And when it comes to relationships, it's matters of the heart. You better know what's on it, and you better know how to express it. And you better recognize how you live without it, because if you live without it, then what you're presenting to others is not that. If you're the one leading this parade and your heart is not there, don't be shocked when people don't value it. Yeah, that's the best way to put it. You always ask why your heart is never valued. It's because you never lead with your heart. Of course, you hide it. It's not something you seek to protect. It's not something you seek to live with. And when I say lead, I mean to integrate it into your life. And that really shows the person. So I also recognize that, what happens when people take off the mask or the 6-month line is they see the psychopath that they didn't think that they were signing up for, but they initially did. The reason why I love these moments is it's so revealing of everything that you've been running from about you. And I've had this in my life. It's, they're not who I thought they were. And it's like, no, that was them all along. The performance is stopping. The state of being is starting. Can you rely on that person? No. Can they be there for you? No. Could they meet your needs? No. So what have you been doing? And what is this thing that's in opposition of you being able to do so? Identify that and actually recognize something. And women they fall fault to this one, which is, I have a bad relationship with my emotions. So I'm going to pick a guy that does. And I'm going to sign up for this guy. Then after I sign up for this guy, I'm going to then realize my relationship with myself and then transfer that onto him and then go, why aren't you emotionally available? So not only were you naive, you're incredibly manipulative, and your relationship with your emotions is something that you wanted him to have so that you can actually start doing the thing you don't do for yourself. So then you're recognizing, these things run deep. So a state of being is something that needs to exist prior because you want to collectively flourish each other's state of being together. Those are two compatible people. You don't need to challenge. Your state of being is in opposition, but for the sake of collaboration. Not the diminishment of each other, which is exactly what happens to most people. What they signed up for was everything that validated their insecurities until they realized their insecurities can never be validated by another person. And so what ends up happening is, you take that scenario. Not only does she feel like she's never being met because she's unconscious of everything that's made her get up into this point, he always feels like he's not enough for the relationship. And then he starts to tell you everything as a woman that you feel about your emotions. Too much, crazy, not making sense, annoying. I'm already stressed enough as it is. And so now what you're recognizing is a little bit of the fraudulent story that you've had. And now here's the thing that's interesting about that's the story you tell yourself. The story that I'm talking about is how these things end. And The funny thing is that we're unaware of being able to accept that doesn't allow us to see the emotions that are underlying that create the conclusive narrative about how these things always are. Because that's not true. And remember that. There's no actual room for people to show up. I always like to bring the sexuality into it because it gets people to think. It's the difference between somebody wanting to give you a blowjob and then them doing a favor. Like, what you really want is the authentic drive and desire to go down, for example. And what I'm noticing is that more people would rather like to get the exchange for what it could validate in themselves, realizing that it now furthered that distance that they were looking for. They're actually more hungry for an authentic presentation of that, and they'll become more desperate in relationship to meeting it. So here's the amount of courage that you're going to need to have in order to accept the psychology of yourself, to recognize that you exist more than just that. I realize that my psychology of me is that nobody can show up. And I always hated whenever I worked with a coach and they go, that's not actually what's happening. There's a reason why I hated it, because then it shined a light on the emotional aspect of myself. And I recognize that being able to accept things is not dismissing them. It's actually showing up for them in the way that you can show up. And so when most people go, oh, well, if I accept them as they are, that they can't meet these needs, then I'll never have these needs. Yeah, you might feel sadness in relationship to that because that could be true in the current moment. But you'll also be able to show up to that person in the way that they can show up, and you won't have an expectation on what they can give you that they never had. So that's really important to understand, which is you expecting something from people is an illogical thing if you've looked at that the last 20 years, they've never been reflective of these characteristics. So what is that saying about you? That you're adopting people that have never shown throughout their whole life to have had these characteristics, that you, for somebody who uses their head and should be very logical if you do think, which most people don't, but if you do, then use your head here and ask yourself a question. Logically, does it make any sense that they would change? And so, actually, it's the acceptance of your total rationale of the whole psychological story that you have. And that's the whole thing about awareness, is that most people are aware of what they think on a psychological level. But when I talk an internal level, it's not just psychological. So there is an importance to understand that human development and improvement is not just through psychology. It's a tool to access that. So there's more dimensions than just that. Because if people were just their psychology, then let's put it this way. Your dad was the narcissistic type, a very high achiever. And your mom, well, she has borderline personality disorder. They make love to each other for 5 years. They have a few kids, and you're one of those unlucky kids, at least in your story. And then now what you're recognizing is that you have the same sum total of both of their thing together. Now, on a psychological level, we like to cope. Meaning that we like to go, no, that's not what happened. They were just confused people and I'm going to be different. No, you're going to be exactly the same because, see, you're still not accepting the truth of the matter here. And this is the importance of things like numbers, is that there's a word for it. I forgot what it was, but it quantifies a truth of sorts, a mathematical truth. And then we could understand that it's not the truth, but it's a way to speak a language that can help give you an understanding of that. And so the way that you understand things, if you don't start accepting what the story is telling you, is through coping, meaning that you never get to experience the dimensions outside of you, which then made this very reflective in my field of work, is that most people's foundation, meaning the very thing that allows them to interact with life, is broken. That they do not have a value system that allows to interact with any of the things that's surrounding them, because I genuinely mean this, that we fight for alignment. Our body is looking for betterment. Our soul is, absolutely. I mean, it's made for that. And you could say, well, then what's in opposition? Our protective mechanisms. Do you know what that even looks like even? It's like, get familiar with at least the hardware. And so that's the thing that we have a hard time with, which is, you see the foundational errors or what allowed you to be here, and you look at your history and it terrifies you and you separate yourself further from it. And now you've separated yourself further from the change that you deeply desire. And it's like, well, what are you looking for in terms of change? Is the person the characteristics, or does the person exist outside of the characteristics? If the difference is awareness, then it's not the characteristics. Because I've noticed that people that direct those very things upward live with the belief that they're not broken. So at the heart of the matter, I've been able to recognize something even deeper, which is you want to experience the dimensions of yourself, but you refuse to accept the one that keeps coming to your face. And acceptance is not the dismissal of something. It's the incorporation of everything that you haven't addressed internally under that. And a lot of the time, the story we have is nothing more than a story. It's nothing more than a mathematical equation that actually allows us to function the way that we do and bond the way that we do too, and you don't want to lose that. It also gives you a particular understanding of the person, and it shapes the individual. And we need to be shaped. And if we're not shaped, we're left to something that we don't quite understand. And we understand that we're a being and we're limited and grounded by being that being, but also unlimited in our contribution through that individual we are born to become. Acceptance. My story went a little like this. They won't be able to meet my needs, and they will never show up when I need them most. When I would tell myself it's not going to happen, it would always happen. And then when I would accept that, then the emotions would come up. Sadness, grief, loss, sometimes even anger, even resentment, bitterness. And then I'm like, wait, what is all these things that I'm feeling? There's a deeper dimension to me. Why would I deny the things that have happened to me? I could provide clarity to them. And that's like kind of removing the variables in an equation. But the answer remains the same. And that's the thing about the answer, is that if we live up here, we're left with all it has to offer. But most people run from their head and they try to go to another place. You're not running from your head. You're still in your head. You're just thinking that you left. And so in a world where people are up here, they become disconnected from reality because the mind is easily fooled, and you can incorporate new things to the equation, and you could saturate them, and you could become a control freak of sorts. But really what's happening inside is emptiness, shuddering, cold, shivering boy or girl lost in the dark, and it's wet. And you're crying, but you can't hear it because you're too caught up in your own equation. And so the interesting thing about accepting these things is the incorporation of what it's revealing about you. And when that happens, it no longer defines you. And when you could accept it without the conclusion of the end of the story, but the beginning, you open up to the dimensions of yourself that truly allow you to express one's self. So at the end of it, what I was able to realize is that most people are busy coping, and they're coping with what they see in the equation, and then they try to change the numbers, and then they change the numbers, and they forget that you just lied to themselves. And then once they lie to themselves, they start to believe those lies, because those lies become very convenient and very protective. And then they seek to protect those lies. And then they gather a group of people who've made that same lie to themselves. And then now you're a puppet for the very thing that we call evil. That's the whole thing about chaos. If you leave it unattended long enough, is that by default, it will resort to that. Those who have the strength and courage in order to attend these particular characteristics, and taking one of the women in my group, which I found was interesting, and this also worked for one of the men in my group, is that they were able to face themselves and perhaps everything that they saw on a psychological level that meant that they would never be loved. And this time was able to just maybe perhaps accept what those things were not the reason why that wasn't the case. The dimensions of ourselves outside of just our experiences, we cannot deny those experiences and how they've happened. You have to provide more clarity onto them. And that's the whole thing about acceptance, which is, have you even thought about what is your story? So if you haven't even got there and you haven't shined enough light on that and struggled enough with that, what makes you think you're going to go to the other dimensions of yourself that could allow you to really see who you are? And so now this is a question of the heart here, because I've noticed one thing for certain is that if this isn't addressed, you're not open. And if you're not open, you're blaming the world for the lack of perfection that it has that could somehow kiss your ass, like you're not contributing to the collapse of the very thing you're looking for. And this is the only thing that I could speak up to, especially at this point, is to utilize my voice to just speak to the part of you that's raising up to look up to more. There's something what they say, and it's a very powerful expression, it's lonely at the top. And that's the whole point. Who the hell would actually want to do this? Real question. You want truth, it hurts. Sometimes it feels good, but it hurts more than it doesn't. Well, you have to recognize how much of our culture has been raised to, has imbued in us a narcissistic ideology. And we continue to interact like that's not there. And something so funny is because I said this one quote, and I want it to ring a bell with you, is that if you were the one that keeps talking about how all your exes were narcissists, you're probably the other one. And that's important for you to understand, because you're forgetting how the culture didn't just put something in, it's bringing something out about our nature. And that's the product of evolution, is that what we didn't know existed is now coming to the surface. And then we're split with this divide, and it's the divide of those that deny that ever existed. And those people become the delusional problem creators, although they think they're solving a problem. And then the ones that completely don't give a fuck at all and just want to watch the world burn. So you have to really think about the kind of courage and the foundation that you have and the things that you really believe about life and what really animates you. And you can't really say the things that animate you are love when you're a terrified individual who's still stuck on the first dimension of their own existence, the way that they think. That is just one. And there's a whole oasis of what an individual has to give. And the beauty of acceptance is not the eradication of the truth. It's maybe being able to accept the truth on a rational level, to be open to dimensions of it. And then when you are, you're no longer the person that sees female nature and runs, or sees their own shadow and runs, or sees the aspect of the masculine that's tyrannical and runs. You become a person that understands that's the very thing that you're subconsciously drawn to on a psychological level, and you accept it as it is, to then realize that there's more beyond it. The victim is the most dangerous of roles any individual can play, and it's played by those who never were able to recognize when they were a victim. The story changes, you change along with the story, once you're willing to accept what the story is. And that's the dimensions of how change works. It's not conclusive. It's the beginning of a question and a series of more questions and then an experience. Most people are naive to what it really is to see somebody who knows what they're saying. It's a connection to something they don't understand that they believe in. It's a component of faith, and faith makes no sense on a logical level. And now you're talking about love? Make that make sense. It's the accumulation of all of our existence, and if we're only familiar with one, it doesn't exist in your life.